Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today we are talking about Jobe Bellingham. Yes, one of Sunderland's best players of the last, well, probably say the last 25 years really, considering how bad Sunderland have been in that time. But yes, we want to talk about Jobe, and the question is, should Jobe Bellingham regret leaving Sunderland? Now, before we get into this, I must say, I love Jobe Bellingham. This isn't meant to be necessarily a criticism of him. It's just more an analysis of that situation where he has went to Borussia Dortmund and seemingly has struggled. And really the question I want to ask is, why did he move? Was it the correct decision? And does he regret not sticking around at Sunderland? So let me know what you think in the comments below about Jobe and his decision to leave the club, and whether you think he will have regrets or he will have looked at the opportunity of joining Borussia Dortmund and thought, that is too big to turn down, even though I'm enjoying myself at Sunderland. So last season, there were rumours that were pretty much rampant. From the summer, Jobe signed a new deal at the start of the 24-25 season, but even then, the rumours were there that he was probably going to leave at the end of the season. And the presumption was that Sunderland probably weren't going to be getting promoted. I think a lot of people looked at us as being maybe a couple of years away from getting the Premier League, but obviously we had a fantastic season. It culminated with a Wembley win. Sunderland get to the Premier League, and there was hope that maybe Jobe would stick around and think, do you know what, why not give it another year, see if we can do something special in the Premier League. But those talks, they didn't work. I know the owner, Kira Louis-Dreyfus, was trying his best to convince Jobe to stay, but he decided he wanted to leave. The club did well by him. They let him go to Borussia Dortmund. They got a good fee. Jobe went to the Club World Cup with them. Sunderland replaced him, spent a lot of money in the summer, and kind of, I think as Sunderland fans, we were sad to see Jobe go, but we got so many, nice new footballers and transfers that we sort of just forgot about him. But now Jobe is back sort of in the conversation because his time there hasn't worked. There's reports that Dortmund aren't happy with him, could potentially be willing to move him on, and that sort of gave me the international break time to reflect and think, do you know what, maybe it's worth talking about. Does Jobe regret making that move? So let's talk about the problems Jobe has faced at Dortmund. And I think the main issue is that he just hasn't fit in there straight away. At Sunderland, he had a pretty well-defined role, certainly under Regis Lebris. He got the best out of him, played him in the correct position. We saw Jobe being much better defensively last season, and he was almost the perfect foil in that Sunderland team in the 4-3-3 that we played. This season, he's went to Dortmund. He started their first two games. He got hooked at half-time in one of them, and he's not started any of the last 4 league games for Dortmund. There's also been rumours that Jobe's dad, Mark, has been pretty vocal at the club with them not using him correctly, not giving him minutes, and yeah, there's a little bit of unrest there between maybe the Bellingham family and Borussia Dortmund. And Bellingham's only played 167 minutes so far in the league for Dortmund, which obviously is not a lot, and especially with the money, I mean, he's a club record transfer for them. I think they were probably expecting him to be playing, every game. I mean, that's what happens when you spend, 40 million euros on a player. And the whole point of this transfer was to take Jobe up a notch. Look, he'd proven himself in the Championship to be one of the best central midfielders at that level. Then he was getting this move to Dortmund. Could he show himself to be that level of player? And so far in the evidence of what we've seen, that hasn't been the case, which again leads to the question of, would he have been better staying at Sunderland and getting eased into the top level with a team where he fits into the system? And those are the questions that maybe Jobe was asking right now. But I think that the point of this move for Jobe when he went to Dortmund was probably to try and squeeze himself into that England setup. I mean, how good would it have been to see Jobe and Jude, the Bellingham brothers, playing together for England? And I think that was probably the motivation behind this move. He probably felt like he couldn't break into that 2026 World Cup squad at Sunderland. Maybe he's right, maybe he's wrong on that point, but I think that's why they were desperate to make this move. But so far, it looks like Jobe's on the outside looking in. So why did Jobe move? And look, we obviously have touched on it a little bit there, but I think what was more puzzling for me at the time of this move happening was I didn't understand why they were so desperate to get him to move to Dortmund. I understand it from a perspective of Sunderland not getting promoted and Jobe not wanting to play in the Championship 100%. I mean, yeah, that makes sense. Jobe clearly had outgrown the Championship as a league and was ready to take the next step. But once Sunderland got promoted to the Premier League, I felt like that conversation should have changed. I also don't understand why Dortmund was the option that they went for. They've Jobe has spent a lot of his early career at Sunderland trying to distance himself from his brother Jude, to then plant yourself into Dortmund where your brother did so well. There's always going to be comparisons there. Oh, he's not as good as his brother, or his brother did this better, or whatever. It doesn't make any sense to me. Jobe put Jobe on the back of his shirt, not Bellingham. He wanted to distance himself, and yet he makes the move to go to Dortmund. That felt puzzling at the time, and I think we're maybe seeing that now, that maybe they underestimated the impact of the Bellingham name in Dortmund and whether or not Jobe could live up to it. And I understand that this move was obviously, it's a tantalising one. Dortmund's one of the biggest clubs in the world. They've got a huge stadium, huge fan base. They're one of the top teams in the Bundesliga. They play Champions League football. I mean, you cannot begrudge Jobe Bellingham for wanting to make this move. But I think playing games at his age is equally as important, and fitting into a system is important. Dortmund play like a 3-4-2-1 formation. Sunderland obviously play largely a 4-3-3 formation, and Jobe was comfortable in that. And Jobe took a risk that he'd fit into this Dortmund team and he'd be able to play at the top level. But there was no guarantees he'd be able to do that. And I think he struggled with the fact it's a change of system, but I think he's also struggled with the fact that the level of play is so much higher. There's been a lot of criticism of Jobe that he's been very conservative, quite passive in games, not as involved. And I think that possibly has as much to do with the system as what it does him as a player. And at Sunderland, he knew exactly what his role was, and he would have known exactly what his role was if he was playing with us in the Premier League. So I don't think we can begrudge Jobe the move, but I certainly think we can sit and question the logistics of it and whether or not it actually made sense for him. Now we can see all the facts, because we sit in October right now and it feels like this move to Dortmund has maybe come a little bit premature for Jobe. And fundamentally, the point of this video is, should he have stayed? And look, I've been beating around the bush on this throughout this whole thing, kind of explaining why the situation hasn't worked for him. But I think the likelihood is if Jobe had stayed at Sunderland, we wouldn't have bought Habib Diarra, because it was basically the same level of transfer fee. And we would have had Siddiqui, Xhaka and Jobe as a middle three. That is how I think Sunderland would have lined up this season. And Jobe would have been a perfect fit for that. He'd obviously done it last season. I think he was ready to make that jump up to the Premier League level, certainly with a team like Sunderland. We know he has good work rate. We know he has, a desire to get into the box and score goals. That's very similar to what Habib Diarra is. So I think he would have fit perfectly in this team. And I think when they lost Jobe, they were probably looking to sign a player of a similar sort of quality and a similar ability and has similar traits. I think they did that with Habib Diarra. So I think from Sunderland's perspective, apart from the fact Habib Diarra is injured, I think they replaced Jobe pretty well. But I think should he have made the move comes to the fact that he would have been playing every minute in the Premier League. He would have been a main point of the Sunderland team. He would have also had a lot of media attention. I think a lot of people were very interested in Jobe. Jobe was a big feature of Sunderland last season, and all the time when they cover Sunderland, they would talk about Jobe. So he would have been probably the biggest name at a Premier League club, playing every single game, being an integral part of this team. And yeah, I think that the reason why they didn't necessarily want that is they didn't want Jobe to be playing in a team that was struggling potentially. And I think that the Bellinghams didn't buy into the fact that Sunderland would be anything more than maybe relegation fodder. I don't know if they trusted the fact that the club may have a strong season. And look, we're only in the early days right now, but it looks like Sunderland have had obviously a good start this season. They've got 11 points. But I think that the Bellinghams did not want Jobe to be in a struggling team. I think that they strategically wanted him to move to one of the better teams at the top level, so that it would be easier for him to adjust. And obviously there's issues with that, there's a scrutiny with that, but when you're playing with better players, in theory you should be better. That's probably one of the reasons why they were willing to leave Birmingham to join Sunderland, because they probably believed that Sunderland would be competing at the top end of the Championship when they made that move. So I think that the Bellingham family are very strategic about the transfers that they want Jobe and Jude to make. And I think that that's what this came down to. I think they made a judgment call this summer that Sunderland would struggle and Jobe would not look as good in the Premier League because Sunderland would be a weaker team. And I think they thought we need to get him into a situation at a top level club. Probably why he didn't move to Crystal Palace last summer and wanted to stay, because they would have said he will look better playing in the Championship for Sunderland, who are one of the better teams, than what he would playing for a lower end Premier League team like Crystal Palace were at that point when that move happened. Obviously, Crystal Palace have done pretty well since then. But I think if you look at this right now, and the stories coming out that Dortmund are willing to, potentially cash in on Bellingham and move him on, and I don't know if they're necessarily true. Look, you buy a player like that, it's a long-term project, but there's clearly issues there between Bellingham and Dortmund. And I think the Sunderland project, if they'd stuck with that, Bellingham would have been a key component in the Sunderland team. He would have known the system. He'd be playing at the top level. Maybe he wouldn't have got in the England team because Sunderland isn't a sexy name. But I think that Bellingham would have had a really good chance if he played for Sunderland for a season in the Premier League and did well to move to one of the European giants next summer, where he would have been better equipped to deal with that if he'd stayed at Sunderland in the Premier League rather than coming out of the Championship and going to a Dortmund, because that is a big jump going from a Championship team to one of the best teams in the world. Massive. If he'd stayed at Sunderland for a year, even if Sunderland got relegated, he would have shown his qualities there and he probably would have been able to gain that move. And look, you have to gamble on yourself there as well. You know, if Jobe is truly going to be one of the best players in the world, he would have shown that in the Premier League at Sunderland, even if they were relegated with 20 points. So I think right now, Jobe Bellingham probably isn't reflecting on it this way. I don't think footballers do. But I do think that he maybe looks and goes, I wish I'd maybe given it another year. Because right now, he's not getting minutes at Dortmund. Feels like he's on the outside looking in. It's going to be hard for him to establish himself there. Maybe he'll do well from that struggle. But I do think that had he given the Sunderland project another year, he probably would have seen his career develop in a better way. But hey, that is just my opinion. Let me know your opinion in the comments below about Jobe Bellingham and whether or not he made the right decision to leave Sunderland this summer. Please leave a like and subscribe to the channel as well if you enjoy this video, and we'll see you for another one very soon.